All right, so welcome to yet another week. This week we're going to be talking about deviance. Deviance is fun. That's why we do it, right? Sociology and deviance have gone back from the very beginning. I'm going to end up talking about Durkheim again today, and Durkheim's clearly one of the early writers about sociology. Maybe it'd be easier if I just started, and then we'll talk about some other stuff. All right. Turns out deviance is actually really hard to understand at a deep level. It ends up being like that statement about pornography. Well, it's hard to define, but I know it when I see it. Deviance is going to, in many ways, fall into the same category. All right, so the first slide here is just a handful of terms. Look, I got the little red thing going. Woohoo! Okay, just a handful of terms and some definitions. I'll go over those, and then we can actually get to talking about the meat of this chapter. So, first of all, deviance is behavior that is outside of norms. All right. Now, there are a variety of different norms. Some of them are written down. We call those laws, and you can get into a lot of trouble for those. Other norms are unwritten, like the book's example of picking your nose in public is a good one. It's always a little bit entertaining to talk about unwritten norms. It wasn't really brought up in the socialization chapter, but there's an overlap between socialization and deviance, which is captured in what are called breaching experiments, or an author named Harold Garfinkel, and his whole thing is ethnomethodology. I don't think it's in the book, but if you want to look it up, it's actually really cool stuff. And the idea of a breaching experiment is the assumption that we don't know what all the unwritten codes of behavior in a situation are unless we break those, okay? So not picking your nose in public is certainly an unwritten code. There's not rules about it. But if someone sat here in the front row, digging for gold, people are gonna be kind of offended by that. For all the talk of public etiquette, whether you hold doors for people, whether you let the old lady go first at the stop sign, whatever etiquette is, that sort of public behavior that smooths things over, that's unwritten. Nobody writes rules about this stuff. One that's deeply entertaining that often the women don't know about is men have rules about restrooms. And the guys all know this. It's so obvious to them that it never occurred to them that the other half of the species doesn't know this. But when there's a line of potties on the wall, you observe public space rules. It's a little bit similar to when the people come in early in class. When people come in early in class on the first day, they space themselves out fairly. In a fair pattern. God, that was awful. Consistently. They space themselves out fairly consistently. And even though most of you right now are sitting right next to someone else, if it was day one and you were here 10 minutes early, and the very next person who came in sat right next to you, that would weird you out. It would feel a little bit like an invasion of your public space. And that's exactly how the urinal is in the restroom for guys, right? If you're standing here and someone else comes in, you can't choose the very next one. What are you doing, buddy? Now, nobody writes these rules. It's not like you're going to get in a fist fight over it, but you'll make people uncomfortable. And with Garfinkel and breaching experiments, you actually walk into those uncomfortable situations and behave in uncomfortable ways to help illuminate what those rules actually are, if that makes sense. And so the whole point there is you can have deviance at the top level where you're breaking laws and getting very serious sanctions. And you can have informal deviance that's just breaking unwritten, informal codes of behavior. All right? So that's deviance defined. There's a couple of more things to this. One of the ones that I'll always bring up is how deviant is it if we all do it? How many of you followed every rule on the way to school here today on the road? Right? Yeah, sure. We got one, maybe. I don't trust him. So if everybody's going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit and the posted speed limit is 60, is that actually deviant? Well, that's an interesting question. That's why I say it ends up being really hard to nail this stuff down, because some rules we break all the time and with complete impunity, and yet they're not just codes of behavior like how to use the potty, it's a written law. I mean, it's a little bit weird that way. You could also just think of deviance statistically. Some people will do this, where if you have a normal curve of behavior, whatever that behavior is, this person over here at the positive end is deviant in one way, and this person over here at the negative end is deviant in the other way. In that sense, someone like Steve Jobs is deviant because, he didn't just go get a computer job somewhere. He, how many people build computer companies and transform the computing industry and make $1 gazillion? Not too many. He's clearly deviant. That would be sort of a positive deviance. Is that positive for you guys? No, that's negative. Positive deviance, right? And then, I don't know who the negative deviance would be, but you get an idea there. Okay, now there's also sanctions. And sanctions are really just the tactics for enforcing the rules, whatever they are. So when you walk into the restroom and you're talking on your cell phone while you're doing your business, everyone's going to look at you like, dude, that's actually a form of negative sanction. We respond, there's always one guy that seems to just completely miss it. But for the most part, we actually respond very quickly and intuitively to other people's social cues. It's kind of built into the herd species aspect of humanity, I guess. And so when people are disapproving, we're kind of going, no, okay? Speeding tickets are certainly a sanction. Gossip behind people's backs, notice how that's also a sanction. Like, you really don't want, one of the biggest reasons to behave in life isn't that you don't want to screw around, it's that you don't want people talking bad about you. It's important to protect your reputation. Well, if you have a crappy reputation, what it means is people are talking bad about you. That's its own form of sanction, if you will. And then there's positive sanctions. The book uses an example of getting a promotion at work. I would actually prefer something even a little bit more direct. If you've got something like a sales job with a base salary, but you get a commission on every sale you make, then notice how the whole, that will drive your behavior. You'll sell more because you can get more. You can get more compensation. At the same time, if they structured it a different way so that everybody made a high salary and you fell below and you got, severe talking to or fired, that's a negative way to enforce the same sort of behavior. That's all sanctions are, is the tactics to enforce these things. That's a positive and the negative. The formal and the informal I already touched on, but formal are codes, right? If you're in jail, if you're in prison, it's because of a formal sanction. But when if you're excommunicated from your church, certainly a formal sanction. But if you just got all of the good people of the world gossiping about you, well, that's an informal sanction. Getting the husband of the woman you were flirting with at the bar to punch you in the nose, that might be painful, but it's an informal sanction, right? Because it's not written down, it's not a law, it's not a rule of any specific organization. You just know you probably shouldn't flirt up the ugly guy's wife in front of him. It's the rules. Okay, now, in and of itself, this is just really straightforward stuff. The real interesting questions become who gets sanctioned and why, right? That's where this gets really thorny and it gets more interesting. Look at that. Okay. Let me make a couple of notes to myself here. Nope, can't write on that. I don't know what this is, but I'm writing on it. All right, there's that. And then what was the other one? So you don't know, do you? It'll come to me. Oh, just a tiny little note. A deviance course in sociology, it's easy for it to deviate, get it? From, well, not from, towards, how do I say this? Let me say it a different way. People will sometimes tongue-in-cheek call deviance a study of nuts, sluts, and preverts. Because anytime you start talking about deviance, you're going to end up talking about mental behavior, right? Mental health. You're going to end up talking about sexual behavior. And sluts and preverts, you'll notice, it's a joke, captures both of those. And there is a certain amount of that in the study of deviance. But if that's your whole focus, you're going to end up losing sight of the larger picture. And today, I'm focusing on the larger picture. That's a better way of saying it. All right, so the first bullet point up here, deviance is not about an act. And the headline, deviance is unavoidable. Walk with me on this. If you approach deviance the way the general public approaches deviance, you're probably concerned about shootings in Macon, drug use at Mount DeSalles. I'm just kidding. But those students do have good stories when they graduate and come to my class. But every school has drugs. Well, those are two good examples. The sexual behavior of our children. There's a lot that we worry about in terms of deviance. And so when the lay public talks about deviance, their approach is, how do we get rid of this? Okay? And politicians like to say, we're going to get rid of crime. And of course, they're full of crap for a couple of reasons. One, it's much harder to get rid of than we think because like many things in economics, it's not necessarily a if A, then B sort of follow through on these things. But second, and more importantly, even if you affected serious change in people's behaviors, their perceptions of deviance aren't going to change. Let me say that again. Even if the actual numbers of murders, rapes, burglaries, child abductions all went down, people's perceptions of deviance are going to stay the same. Okay? So there's an example that Durkheim gives us, and it's a wonderful example. But he makes a case, if you had a society of perfect people, so I put a community of monks up here, although they're certainly not perfect, but at least some of them actually exist. If you had a world of monks, let's see. In terms of informal deviance, it's kind of fun to get up and walk out in the middle of a deviance lecture. I like that. All right. In a society of monks where nobody burglaries, right? Nobody rapes, nobody steals. I guess we covered that with burglary. Nobody beats up the monk in the next room. They're all great guys. What kind of deviance problem do they have? Well, you want to say, well, obviously they don't have a deviance problem because they're not thieving and raping and pillaging monks. What the argument's going to be, however, is that they're still going to spend time worrying about deviance. But what they're going to worry about is who was on time to the 4 a.m. prayers, right? And even if nobody was actually late, and think about the people you know in real life, you know this would happen. Even if everybody was at prayers 5 minutes before they actually started, then instead of complaining about who's late, they're going to complain and gossip to each other about who was least early, right? I can't believe Joe just rolled out of bed with his hair sticking up sideways and wandered in here with only 10 minutes to spare. Like it's a 4 a.m. prayer that's going to last 15 minutes. And 10 minutes to spare isn't enough. Now, the point isn't that the prayer, that the buffer time is longer than the prayer. The point is, if you have nothing big to complain about, you're going to complain about little things. Precisely because humans are wired to try and understand these social rules, these levels of deviance. Okay? Yeah, it's good stuff. So, see that piece? It was right there, and I was like, okay, and then, it'll come to me. It'll come to me. All right. So there's 4 functions of deviance if you want to think about it this way. Okay? The first is it affirms cultural norms, which is just a fancy way of saying we all understand the rules because we see what happens when they're broken. All right? So if you were a man and you were brand new to the United States and you walked into a restroom and you used the wrong potty, right? You're going to get enough funny looks and people saying, give me some room, buddy, right? You're going to get enough grief that eventually you're going to figure it out, right? So that the proper rules are going to be communicated just in terms of people interacting with each other. Secondly, and this is just as important, the rest of us also understand and reaffirm those norms. It's not just the guy who's getting people gossiping about him, but we're figuring it out too. So when you're walking out of the restroom with your friend, I can't imagine what goes on in girls' restrooms. It's got to be the same stuff, just a little different. But when you're walking out and you're saying, seriously, who carries on a full-on conversation with their investment banker over the Bluetooth while they're taking a whiz? When you're walking out and you're saying that, not only are you sanctioning that guy, you're also reinforcing the proper behavior between the two of you. Okay? And that sort of should make some sense. Now that's a small thing, but look at big things, right? At the complete opposite other end of the spectrum, there are things you can do which are so bad that not only are you going to get thrown in prison for the rest of your life, the other prisoners may mess you up for it, right? So you like to rape little children. That's okay. We'll throw you in maximum security, but not in solitary. And everybody knows what's going to happen, right? He's going to get beat a lot. So if what you're doing is so bad that not only is the whole society ready to throw you in prison and throw away the key, but even the other bad guys are willing to beat your ass once you're in there, if I may speak frankly, then that's pretty bad, right? And that's the other end. Now, think about what's going on there. The prisoners are saying, okay, I may be a rapist and he may be a murderer, but we're not that guy. It's crazy, isn't it? But it's kind of cool when you recognize how it works. We're not that kind of people. I like that one. The clarifies right and wrong works exactly the same way. And you'll notice, again, this is why I brought up the point about gossip. Think about how much of your actual talking, think about how much of your actual listening is filled up with gossip about what's right and what's wrong. Clearly, the news becomes a big chunk of this. I mean, why do I care how Saudi Arabia punishes its citizens? Does it bother me if Saudi Arabia is cutting heads off of people as a form of execution, state execution? I mean, we do it with drugs, they do it with blades, who cares, right? Well, it's hard to say that I do, because it doesn't really affect my life, but then at the same time, if we're having a conversation about the death penalty, and we say, well, you know, look, at least when we do it, it's humane. Those guys are crazy. We're saying, well, there's a difference there, and here's what that difference is. Now, that's the death penalty and a foreign government. But think about the last time you got dumped on text messaging. Ugh, I can't believe it. I was getting sick of that relationship, and she was pissing me off anyway. But I was just being nice. I was waiting for it to work out properly, and she dumps me on text message. Like, if she only had the backbone to say it to my face. Once again, yeah, right. But we're saying there's a difference between being dumped face to face and being dumped on text message. I just saw that she changed our Facebook status. Mine didn't, I'm kidding. Right? So, you know, in the grand scheme of things, you broke up, relationships don't work out. So why this nuanced, well, this is better than this is better than that? Well, we're sorting out essentially right from wrong. It's kind of crazy that way. So if everything from the evening news to 3/4 of the internet news to the way we talk about our friends is this sort of gossiping about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, you start to get a sense of exactly how much of our mind space is devoted to this topic of deviance. All right? Unifies those inside of society. This one's a little bit cool. So when I first moved to Warner Robins, we used to live in Macon. I'm just going to throw that out there when we first got here. So we moved to Warner Robins. And we get into our neighborhood. And I know some of you have heard this story, but it's a great story. We move into our neighborhood, and on the second week, I'm driving home at 4:30 or something because it was summertime. And the cops won't let me into my subdivision. Because all of Warner Robins is subdivision, right? Anyway, the cops won't let me into my subdivision. I'm about to get all pissed off at them when I start to hear gunfire. Didn't I just move from Macon? But anyway, so I hear gunfire, and then the cop's really getting pissed at me. So I did what he said. Okay, so we have the shooting. The shooting's on, you know, our little cul-de-sac. Nothing bad happens, which is a good thing. It was a little bit entertaining because, you know, life gets boring. But the best thing was I met every single one of my neighbors. Now, how long does it take to actually get to know your neighbors in a sprawly subdivision kind of community like Warner Robins? You know, years could go by and you won't meet the person across the street. But what happened, this was great. What happened was everyone came out to say, no, our neighborhood is not like this. Number one. Dude, we know everyone in Georgia has guns, but it's not okay to get drunk, take lots of drugs, shoot up your house, and start shooting at the cops. Right? Right from wrong. Number three, because we've got this example of clearly unacceptable deviant behavior here, the rest of us all get to pull together in a moment of neighborhood solidarity. Think about the American war effort. I know most of us are too young. But think about the American war effort after Pearl Harbor. There was actual debate whether or not the U.S. needed to be involved in Europe's stupid wars yet again. Pearl Harbor happens, and we're on board. Think about 9/11, right? The country is not really on a, oh, look, we'll all be together, kumbaya track. And we weren't in 2001. But after 9/11, for a while, we all pulled together, right? It's kind of crazy. But by having an outside threat, that sort of deviance does create cohesion. All right, can foster change. Now this happens in, I have two examples off the top of my head that I'm going to talk about here. Okay? The first, the book's example, is something like Rosa Parks. So it was clearly not okay in late 20th century America, land of the free, to have two completely different codes and sometimes laws for different flavors of human based upon their level of tanness, right? Now, a certain amount of this was, well, it's what we have from the past. And the past isn't perfect, but we'll work with what we have. And, whatever. I mean, we're not trying to make excuses, but you see how you can get there. And someone else says, no, that's just not cool. And civil disobedience of Rosa Parks and others allowed for people to recognize how unacceptable that situation actually was. Like, all right, we're really going to change this. And after it was changed, you don't even have 10 years go by before even the people who were against the change, at least publicly, oh yeah, no, I never believed that, right? And maybe it wouldn't have happened without Rosa Parks. It probably would have, but it would have been somebody else, right? Because you had this tension brewing. That's one example, and that's the book's example. But notice, a few minutes ago, I used the Steve Jobs example. And I think that this is a better example, although it's not what the book brings up. I think the book says Rosa Parks. Okay, so at its fundamental core, why do we have deviance, right? The first answer to that question, and it's echoing through everything we're talking about here, is it's because people aren't the same. We have variation. We have diversity in today's modern sort of language. If you look around, physically, this whole classroom is diverse. We have tall, we have short, we have, sort of wide, sort of less wide, sort of more wide. We have men, we have women, maybe we have in-betweens. If so, good for you. In a class this big, we've got gay folks, we've got straight folks, you name it, we've got everybody. In a class this big, we have people who are fairly well-to-do and others who are at the other end of that scale, right? Every single thing you want to talk about in terms of humanity, you've got a diversity of behavior, okay? So notice one of the examples I gave was if you have a standard curve of something, one understanding of deviance is people at the different edges, okay? If the system is working well, and it doesn't always, but if the system is working well, we can curtail the more obnoxious bad behavior. Yes, this is the low side. We can curtail the more obnoxious bad behavior, according to this theory, and we can encourage the more beneficial good behavior. So why did I use Steve Jobs as an example? If you think of Steve Jobs from a business perspective or a computer perspective, he's never invented anything really new. What he did, however, was realize the full extent of the hardware that existed in a way that people didn't yet know that they wanted it. Steve Jobs did not invent the smartphone, BlackBerry did that 7, 8, 10 years earlier, and the BlackBerry was pretty good. But then when Steve Jobs took that same technology and tied it in with tablets, touchscreen tablets, again, have been around since Windows 95, I think. The technology existed, puts it together in a way that's easy for you to understand and use, and bam, the reason you have the cool smartphone you do is at least a little bit because of Steve Jobs' visionary abilities, right? Now, think about this in terms of the normal curve. We have murderers and rapists and robbers on this side for exactly the same reason we have the Steve Jobses on this side, if that makes sense. And you wouldn't want to live in a different world, I promise you. Because in a different world, we'd be ants. And we'd all have the same abilities, the same strengths, and the same weaknesses. And that's not how we are as humans. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions on this bit so far? Yeah. Yes, it did work. All right, super. So what Deviance then ends up being about isn't about who does bad things, who does too many drugs, who does too many serial killings, although that matters. Deviance ends up being about the community, right? So when you've got a population, well, let's actually start with a fairly small population. If you have, let's say, a church group, and it's a fairly specific church group with fairly specific behavioral expectations, right? Someone who flubs those expectations too much, you can ask to leave, right? That's the whole point behind excommunication. Sorry, you're not hanging out with us, and you kick them out. Now, if you're dealing with a church group that says you're only allowed to have sex when it's time to procreate, and you get married and you have sex for fun once, right? Your church group's absolutely within their rights to ask you to leave. And so you leave. Well, is it okay to have sex for fun in a larger group? Absolutely. In fact, maybe another church will even take you in. Well, okay, when you start reenacting scenes from 50 Shades and posting about it on the internet, your church might ask you, your new church might ask you to leave, right? And so, okay, but that's all right because America's big enough for people that like 50 Shades of Grey. Heck, it's making stacks of money, right? That's fine. But let's say you eventually start doing something that's illegal, so you get thrown in prison for a month. But it wasn't that bad, so after a month you're back on the streets, time served. But then you do something that's so bad you get thrown in prison for years, right? And then maybe you do something so bad you're never getting out. Or maybe you're even being excommunicated. At each step, at each level, you're being asked out of the group. And all of those functions, number 1 through 3, and maybe even 4, that I had on the last slide, all end up being about maintaining the boundaries of that group. Now, the United States is 300 million people. Theoretically, we're a land of freedom, so as long as you're not hurting anybody else, you're free to live whatever life you want. So the boundaries for America, in theory, are pretty large. But within America, right, you have a whole bunch of other much smaller communities that all have differing and sometimes a little bit contrasting ideas. Not contrasting so much that they clash with the United States as such. When I use the term America, I'm trying to get at the sort of national vibe, but I think you get the idea. You can't clash too much with the larger country, or you get boosted. But if you're working for an investment firm on Wall Street, they have different rules than a little cinder block church in the country around here, and they have different rules than than Mormons out in Utah, and they have different rules than punkers down in Austin. You see how it works? Like, it's a big country with a lot of different groups on the inside. And again, theoretically, what you have to do to get kicked out of the whole group is pretty bad. That's what deviance is about. Deviance really ends up being about how we maintain our community and how we maintain our community boundaries. So when someone says, well, I think we're being too easy on the bad guys, notice what they're saying is, if we're easy on the bad guys, then anybody can belong and there's no rigor to the group. But you can also be too hardcore, and if you're too hardcore, it's you and 3 friends, and that's not a very effective group. So you have to sort of balance that. I love it. Okay, so we hit number 2. Most gossiping is about these boundaries. Number 3. Number 3 gets to part of the problem that where deviance again gets a little bit murky. So over the weekend, I watched some of Wolf of Wall Street because it was on Netflix and I didn't have to pay for it. Crazy show that. I've never seen more drugs in my life. And so then I went and I looked because I thought this movie was about somebody, but it's kind of almost like a comedy. It's so over the top. So I Googled it up, and sure enough, DiCaprio, who's the main actor in this movie, sat and interviewed some guy that got put in jail for years for insider trading crap. And the guy said, in fact, the movie underestimated how bad it was. Holy crap. Okay. I was picking on Macon earlier. How many chances does a kid in Macon have with regard to crack? The answer is maybe 2, right? Gets caught once, maybe as a lenient judge says, don't screw up again, boom, 2, that's it. How hard is it going to be for that kid in Macon to get away with a real bad crack habit? Well, considering that all the cops are in his neighborhood watching, right, he's going to get caught. I mean, that's one of the things that comes out of the welfare and drugs debate. We should drug test people on welfare. And we do, and the results are so much lower than the generic population, it's not even funny. Okay, so this kid has a lot of surveillance on him and really doesn't have a lot of room to screw up. And yet, this other dude, he didn't go to jail for drugs, he went to jail for cheating when it came to finances, right? Why the difference? Why does one person get to do all the illegal drugs they can stomach without killing their liver, and another person gets 3 shots? Well, it's because, let's face it, the kid in a funky neighborhood in Macon is not in the same place as a Wall Street player, is he? They have different sorts of social power. There is a scene in the movie where the guy asks, it's his buddy that he ends up building the firm with, says, how much money do you make? That's a nice car you're driving. I made $72,000 last month. Well, if you're making $72,000 a month in the 80s, then you matter more than most of the rest of us. Now, notice how that mirrors kind of the discussion about accents and fashion we had a few weeks ago, right? If you are close to power, you're going to be faster picking up accents. Your accent's going to sound more neutral, and you're going to be faster with fashion trends. The farther away you are from power, the more like a country hick you're going to sound and look, right? Because, let's face it, if you're out here, you're not close to power, right? And if you're out here, you don't get a whole lot of shots with law breaking. Whereas if you're over here, you can break the law apparently with impunity. It was kind of an astounding show. I was kind of thinking the same thing as I was going 8 miles an hour over the speed limit on 75, and I got passed by a sheriff's car cruising along at 83, 84, 85 miles an hour. He wasn't in a hurry. he was driving like I was, but if I was already 8 miles an hour over the speed limit, then this dude's doing 85. Now, granted, when the cops got to be somewhere, they got to be somewhere. But why does he get a wider buffer on the speed limit than I do? It's because, let's face it, my grasp, the amount of social power I have, much less than the guy with, right, with the badge. The very definition, I got to do what he says. So he gets to drive faster, period, right? I could complain, I could do a dash cam, I could put up a YouTube campaign, and maybe it embarrasses, whatever the local cops are, and they'll say, yeah, here's a $100 fine, whatever, right? Is it because the cops are bad? No, it's that they're higher than the rest of us in terms of social power, right? And that's just the way it is. You know that those are the rules. But see, that's where it gets to be problematic. Do you have any problem with the cop driving 85 miles an hour? Interesting. As a theoretical question, well, they're all bound by the same rules. But of course, they have high-speed car training. I do not. If they go the same speed I'm going, they're only going to be monitoring 3 guys on the freeway anyway, and it's going to be the 3 that they see. So if they want to actually cover any ground and keep everyone else driving well, then they either got to go a lot faster or a lot slower because they'll be caught in the river, right? So maybe it's not a problem. I'm not saying it is, but I am saying how we apply those rules varies. But it varies on all of these axes. Okay, this is one of my favorite points. I love this one. One of the points that I used a handful of drug examples. Is it interesting? Well, let me rephrase this because it's too big a class to really ask. I think it's interesting that drug dealers are some of the baddest bad guys in our country. When it comes to who the bad guys are, one thing we all agree on is drug dealers are bad. Which I think is interesting because I see at least one Starbucks cup here today. There's probably some caffeine in that pop. I mean, why are drug dealers extra bad? Does a drug dealer make you take drugs? I mean, a drug dealer says, you say, hey, look, I want good stuff. I am so old, I can't even tell you what good drugs are. I want some weed, man. Okay. The drug dealer's going to give me what I asked for. I'm gonna pay him for it. Who cares, right? I want some speed. That's like 60s terminology. I want some speed. All right, here you go. Give me what you paid for. How about some crack? Okay, here you go. Give me what you paid for. If I'm asking for something entirely voluntarily, and they're giving it to me entirely voluntarily, and I'm paying them, it's not a problem, right? And then some will say, well, you get addicted to drugs, and that's sort of problematic. And it is sort of problematic, but I don't think anybody complains too much when they're cashing their check from Nestle's, which owns a couple of tobacco companies, are they? Right? So if I sell you something that you're addicted to, but it's legal, that's okay. It's if I sell you something that's illegal and you're addicted to, that's a moral problem. So why is it a moral problem to cash, why is it a moral problem to sell meth but not RJR tobacco? I don't have an answer. So I love that drug dealers are the ultimate bad guy in our society. But then when I think about this, I think, well, is there some sort of parallel that helps illuminate this problem? Okay? And I'm still on this last point here. And when I think about that, I think a little bit about the Salem witch trials, which sounds a little bit funny comparing them to drugs, unless we're talking about hallucinogens, which is the way modern scientists try and understand it. Like, oh, there was Argo in their grain. I don't actually know what was going on, but I don't care. Now, think about the Salem witch trial era. They were clearly very, very religious. And I don't know what the numbers were. So it's probably exaggerated a little bit, but I think you guys know this already. One of the ways you find out if someone is a witch is you devise a way to kill her. And if she dies, well, she wasn't a witch, right? And there were a couple of them. There was like you would dunk them in the water and see if they didn't drown. And then you would, when you're giving someone when you're playing basketball, you're doing full court press. Or when you're leaning on somebody, you're trying to get something out of them, you're pressing them. Well, that terminology comes from, again, witches and witch interrogations. That's not the right word, but it works. Okay, and the idea was you'd actually lay the girl on the ground and you'd put a board on her, and then you'd start putting rocks on her on the board because you're trying to press her. And if she's a witch, she's going to be able to handle supernatural amounts of weight. And if she's not a witch, well, conveniently, she's dead anyway, and so your problem solved. Okay, now I want you to think about that in terms of what you think about our awesome country, right? You're innocent until proven guilty in America, but the way we prove you guilty might kill you. Oops. So, in effect, the mere accusation that you're a witch could be a death sentence. Like, what the heck were they thinking? It's a little bit crazy. But then you step back and you start thinking about this. Well, who were the worst bad guys in those eras? Well, they were the witches or anybody dealing with demonology. There were people who were on the negative side of religion. Okay, who was actually the most important person in that society? Well, they were clergy, and they were on the positive side of religion. And they were very often tied in with the local political structure. You ran the town, and you were the preacher, right? So what this tells us isn't that they were nuts, although I still sort of wonder. What it tells us is that religion was important to them. And if you did religion the right way, you were the best good guys that were possible. And if you did religion the wrong way, you were the worst bad guys possible. Does that make sense? Now, then we step back and we say, well, what does it tell us if drug dealers are really the baddest bad guys in our society? Does it tell us drugs are a problem? Not necessarily. Not any more than the Salem witch trials tell us witchcraft, sorcery, witchcraft and sorcery were, I think I need vitamins today. These words are just coming and going. Witchcraft and sorcery were a problem, right? I'm sure that there were negative outcomes in their world, and it may have had to do with witchcraft and sorcery, but really what it tells us is that religion is important to them. Okay, so if we step into today's world, if drug dealers are the worst people in society, if we're using this allegory, then it might suggest to us that positive drug dealers are some of the most well-respected people in our society. And indeed, who doesn't want their son or daughter to grow up to be a doctor? Right? And doctors save lives. They make a lot of money. Doctors are well respected. What do doctors do all day? They hand out prescriptions. Right? And if you go to the doctor, not only do they hand out prescriptions, they even recognize that's most of what they do. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, now remember, you just had to pay your copay, or you had to pay cash, and the doctor says, yeah, sounds like a virus. You've been miserable for a week. Just go home and take some Sudafed, and it'll be better in a few days. You're going to feel ripped off, and you're going to complain. So the doctors, they write you prescripts because as a patient, it makes you feel happy. Okay, interesting. Now, could it be that actually these guys are tied in with the political structure. I don't know if physicians are, but healthcare and medicine are some of the largest segments of our society or of our economy right now. Pharma companies make billions of dollars. Some pharma brands, not just the company, but individual brands can break $1 billion a year. So if the brand can break $1 billion, then what does the company make? And if that company can make that, what does the holding company make? See how that works? And do these guys influence public policy? Oh, you can bet they probably do, right? We had an insurance problem and we got Obama to give us an insurance bill. No comment, but it does help us try and understand then what's going on when we start talking about drug dealers. We're not actually, it's not to say that the problems that happen with illegal drugs aren't a problem. It is, however, to say that when we talk about how bad drug dealers are, part of what we're talking about is simply how important drugs are. And also, how important it is that if you're going to do drugs, you go through the acceptable channels, right? At the same time, remember that bit about social power? At the same time, how much obnoxiousness gets covered up by people who progress through the proper channels, and how much obnoxiousness ends up affecting people that followed the wrong path, right? Correct? And that gets to be a little bit interesting too. If you're an old lady and it's 17, when were the witch trials? All right. If you're an old lady and it's 1645, you could help somebody and someone could accuse you of witchcraft because, look, you actually helped somebody. These are also often the old women that knew about herbs, so it's not surprising that people were weirded out. There were often the old women that knew how to birth babies and stuff. Like it wasn't, but they didn't have much social power. And so all it took was an accusation, and before you know it, they're in serious, serious trouble. Does that mean that the leadership in 1645 in all of these communities was above reproach? Not at all. Did bad things happen under the guise of these people's leadership? Yes, sometimes terrifying stuff. Go read about it. Okay. Then you have to ask, I wonder what goes on in terms of drugs in our world. For all the talk of illegal drugs and the problems that they come along with, I wonder how many problems come from legal drugs that we never notice, right? When we start talking about the money generated on the illegal side versus the money generated on the legal side, we're talking orders and orders of magnitude larger, okay? So when we come over here and say, well, I think there's probably 15,000 deaths a year because of illegal drugs, well, what's happening on this side, right? When it comes to medicine, how many deaths are coming from doing medicine the right way? And is there a comparison? Now, I'm not saying, I don't actually know all the numbers on this, but what I am saying is, if you can zero in on what's important to a society, deviance, the things that we actually enforce, right, are going to tell us what's important to that society. And if we're correct, then there's going to be a positive pole as well. Hopefully that makes a certain amount of sense. Yeah, like I'm sitting here thinking, and I can't think of any, there have been salt wars in the past. I can't imagine anybody getting promoted because of salt or executed because of salt, because in our society, no one cares about salt, right? You don't have old Bocephus singing songs about a tall tree and a short rope for a salt dealer, right? Because it's not important to us. But a drug dealer, that's important. Nevertheless, salt was an important enough commodity that in the past, nations fought over it. So in one environment, you can start wars. In another environment, nobody even cares. And think about religion. Religion has declined in our society. Not everybody likes that. But you could, was it this campus? Maybe it was the Macon campus. But at least when I first got here, whoever it is probably graduated, had a bumper sticker on his or her window that said, I'm a pagan and I vote. You know, you could go out and get a witchcraft bumper sticker and slap it on your car, and no one's going to press you to death. No one's going to put you underwater to see if you're a witch or not. You'll piss off your, can I say that? I can say that. You'll anger your conservative neighbor, and they'll gossip about you, right? I mean, it's funny how that is. Okay, questions on this? Go ahead.
I just have talking about the drug dealers and how they're the bad guys and everything.
Yep.
I see. The thing is, back then, 60s and 70s, the drugs were, pure, so to speak, and so it made people happy and stuff. And if somebody died, it was because they took too much of it. Now, the drug dealers are mixing the drugs with other stuff to make it last longer, make more money. Like some of them put rat poison in it, and people are dying not because they took too much, because the drug had rat poison, or and that's what's giving them like the worst. They're the baddest of the bad. So.
Well, when did Simple Man come out? Who knows the date on that song? It's not new, is it? No. I didn't think so. Here's the thing. Don't do drugs. Don't mistake anything I said for an endorsement of drug use. I think your brain is important. I think your liver is important. 63? 73. So that was only 5 years after the hippie revolution of 68. Thank you. I think that we might be recreating history. We hear that. I've even said crap like that. Not crap, you're not talking crap. I've said stuff like that myself, but I think if we go back and look, in fact, we're taking for granted a truth that isn't quite there, and we're also glossing over how controversial what was going on then, actually how bad it was. I mean, this was the heart, not the only part, but at the heart of the red-blue culture wars, which my kids are still debating in the classroom in middle school. So now, in terms of how drugs have changed, we have lots more drugs than we ever did, number one. Number two, I don't know if I would trust drug dealers, because I would expect all of them to want to maximize their profits, and they're not going to do it legally by definition. So you don't know what it's cut with. But they got to be careful too. They can't kill off all their customers. Those are informal. Most drug dealing nowadays is informal social networks. So if you buy some funky stuff and you give it to your husband, right, and your husband ends up dead, you're going to go to your friend Chad. You're going to say, Chad, what the hell did you sell me? So there's a little bit of pressure there to keep your product a little bit clean, but don't do drugs, right? Don't do drugs.
When they were doing the reruns of Saturday Night Live, they made it to the 70s, 78, mm-hmm. 70, and it was amazing how back then they obviously liked their cocaine a lot on Saturday
mm-hmm.
Live. That's pretty much, it seems like they all did that because they constantly brought it up. And now, like, if you were to say the things that they said then, mm-hmm. They would probably get shut down today.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, you're actually getting into some really interesting stuff there. So let me say, number one, when it comes to the culture wars, which is partly what this ends up being about, whatever's going on with the culture wars, it's driven society for the last 40 years, at least since the 70s. And for anyone that's younger than I am, go watch Vroom Vroom, Easy Rider. Go watch Easy Rider And you'll get a sense of how significant this upheaval was at the time. In today's world, it looks a little bit cheesy because it's from like the early 70s. But the fact that you could make this movie, show it to all the hippies and have them go, yeah. Then go read about Ken Kesey's electric Kool-Aid acid test to see what the hippies were really up to. Check out some old footage from Woodstock on YouTube, and then go watch Leave It to Beaver. Because the revolution in the 60s that started with civil rights, which obviously was awesome and 100% necessary, and in retrospect, nobody will complain about, and then turned inward to expanding your mind, questioning your religion, questioning your sexual mores, your received sexual mores. That explosion never went away. The only thing that happened is that the people who were caught up in that fight got older, right? So by the time you get to, and I think I said this in here the other day, but by the time you get to the 2000 election, and on one side you have Bush, who joined the Texas Air National Guard, because he's a good soldier, right? He got his daddy to put him in something. And then here's Kerry, right? Who was down in Vietnam on a swift boat, except maybe who really knows? I mean, I'm not saying I agree with either perspective. What I am saying is we question both of them. When the whole thing comes down to you went to Nam or you got your daddy to buy you out, notice we're fighting the same fight as the people who, because it's the same people who were having protests and putting daisies in the barrels of the conservatives' guns. Also, when you want to think about how scary that time period must have been to them, it's easy for me because it's before my time, I didn't care. It's easy for me to take it for granted because a certain amount of casual drug use has been accepted into the culture. The idea that your sexuality is up to you is accepted into the culture, right? Like a lot of the good stuff that could be had from that we've gotten, not all of it, and we can make more, blah, blah, blah. But if you go from a world of Beaver Cleaver and 50s diners, every town I've ever been in has a 50s diner with black and white tile on the floor and 1950s cars. The reason people like the 50s so much is precisely because that was such an upheaval, such a revolution. And you have to remember that we went from, oh my gosh, things look like finally they're great. It's been 20 years since we had the World War. People are finally happy. Things are okay. I'm just going to get my crew cut and wear my suit and go to work. And isn't America wonderful? And then in the middle of that, you have race riots. You have cities burning down, because that was an outcome of some of the rioting. You have one leader after another politically getting gunned down. You have the hippies who are taking everything from a conservative's mindset, everything that could possibly lead a good life and throwing it completely out the window, right? Like that time period was so frightening for those guys that each one of them put their feet on whatever side they were on and they nailed them to the ground. Kunk, kunk. Little Mermaid, right? Someone needs to nail that girl's fish to the feet, fins to the floor, right? Anyway, they nailed their feet where they were and they weren't going to change. And now they're 70 years old and they're still voting and it's still the same debate. Are you for illegalizing abortion and legalizing guns? Or are you for gay marriage? Because as far as the political system is concerned, there are no other issues. Why? Because those people have been fighting those issues for 40 years. So we have to be careful about understating how frightening that must have looked to the squares. It's a marvelous, fascinating period to study. There was a whole thing, I remember reading some original documents that were written in like 72, And it wasn't from the squares perspective, this was from the hippies perspective. And this was after folks had moved out to communes in Colorado, like free land kinds of things. And they really, actually, honestly thought people were going to drop out of their everyday boring square lives and go live like hippies. Like, because clearly the rat race sucks. We all know the rat race sucks. That's why Facebook's full of Zen, Buddha, choose your own path crap, because the rat race sucks. So these guys are like, oh, it's just a few years before everyone quits and joins a commune. Like, seriously? How could you possibly, like, looking back, it's so naive, it's ridiculous. But these are the people singing, this is the dawning of Aquarius. Like, they really thought, that was beautiful. They really thought something different was going to change, right? We're going to be studying, like, for me, this is right about when I was born, so it's not news, right? But I guarantee we're going to be studying that period for another 100 years. It was that important to our culture as Americans. That was the first thing. God dang it, what was the second thing? Because you were talking about drug dealers and dirty coke, and Je suis Charlie. So I think I said this before, but think about this. So a couple weeks ago, that French newspaper office got shot up by evil Islamists. I don't even know the right word for that. And we all said, oh, those guys are bad, je suis Charlie, right? Je suis is French for I am. So, and the name of the satire magazine was Charlie Hebdo. So here's the thing that's weird about that. And again, we need to think real seriously about this, because I'm thinking specifically of, if we made those jokes about cocaine nowadays, would that be okay? And the answer is absolutely not. Charlie Hebdo, and France has its own internal ethnic problems and its own immigration problems. And the fact that a nation that's as PC as France, which doesn't allow for hate speech, but allows that kind of religious satire, that's something to think about. For all of our talk of free speech, I'm not sure something like Charlie Hebdo would fly here. All right? Now, first of all, if we pick on Islam too hard, the left, oh, that's my left. If we pick on Islam too hard, the left here is going to say, only a few Muslims, only a few Muslims are bad dudes. And that's 100% true, right? And clearly they're right? So we can't pick on Islam too hard or the hippies are going to get pissed. However, I will say, our response to anything we don't like here and now is to try and get it banned. Now, we don't do it politically, we try and do it economically. So these same hippies are rejoicing because finally they're putting enough pressure on advertisers that Rush Limbaugh is struggling a little bit financially. Okay? Now, I'm not a fan of Rush. I don't know what to say about him being good or bad. He's Rush, and if you like him, you like him, and if you don't, you don't. Whatever. But if the response to, wow, this guy hates gays and says terrible things about gays, so I'm going to get him kicked off the air by getting his sponsors to boycott him, notice you're not actually living in a world of free speech, are you? You're not willing to tolerate someone that's different. You actually want to get rid of them. You're just going to apply the economic pressure to do so. And in our environment, that's fair. Okay? So when it comes to Je suis Charlie, right, or what's acceptable, in our environment, somehow or other, we don't go, yeah, that's really tacky, I don't like it, and turn it off. We go, oh my God, that's really tacky, I hate it. Maybe I can get enough outrage on Tumblr that we can get this person shut down. So the Je suis Charlie thing wouldn't happen here because that magazine would never, ever have enough followers to actually survive. Because our hippies would be the ones trying to shut it down. And then after the thing happened, our conservatives would be the ones saying, God, we got to get rid of Islam. Like, je suis Charlie just doesn't happen on either side of the aisle in our political environment, which is an awesome, thank you. That was good stuff. All right, how are you all? Any other questions? Because there's only 5 minutes. I don't want to start the next thing with only 5 minutes. All right, thanks. Have a marvelous Monday for many more years. That doesn't work.